Thanks very much, Nathan, and hopefully you can all hear me well. It's really a pleasure to be able to present to you today. I'm a little bit sad I couldn't be there to join you in Brisbane, but we're getting used to these online world these days, so really pleased I can join you. I'm dialing in from Vancouver today, where I'm on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, and really, as I said, really a pleasure to be able to share some of my work with you today, and always keen to continue collaborations with UQ. So thanks to those who are in person, and nice to be able to see you, and to those who are online as well. So I thought it would be good to begin by talking a little bit about why water is such an important topic, and why why it's continued to interest me for so long. I have a few introductory slides that are probably not hugely surprising to those of you who work on water issues, but I felt it was good to begin with this context anyhow. And I think for me, having worked on water and mining issues for some years, I still really love the fact that no matter where in the world I go, there's always a different kind of water-related challenge, and the diversity of water issues that crop up in different parts of the world continue to excite me and interest me. And when I moved to Canada, joined UBC back in 2017, it quickly became apparent to me that the kinds of water issues over here were substantively different from those that I was most familiar with in the Australian context. And there was a presentation back in 2018 at a conference here, where the CEO of Goldcorp got up and said that, we're not only in the business of mining, we're also in the business of water. And that was a pretty profound statement to come, from someone quite senior in the organization. And the kind of statistic there on the left just speaks to some of the calculations they'd been doing within their company around how much water they were moving at their sites relative to how much ore they were putting through their mills, and found that in some cases they were moving 15 times the volume of water to what they were ore. So just to say that, very much this idea of being able to be a good water manager is a really central component of being a mining company, in particularly in water abundant areas, but also in water scarce areas. We naturally also have challenges with moving water around, and so in places like Chile, where we've got mines that are located very far inland in water stressed areas, where infrastructure needs to be built from the sea to the mountains, also very expensive to install that infrastructure, and in some cases, the costs of infrastructure in those water scarce environments can be a very significant part of the overall capital expenditure for new projects. So just to say that water is often an expensive item on company balance sheets, and that's just one of the many reasons why it's such an important topic. Mining needs water for various reasons. Water is often the primary, foundation for a lot of the mineral processing and ore separation that we do in the mineral processing stages. But also water is needed in mining for dust suppression, to facilitate equipment washing and pumping. In some cases, we may need to supply potable water for sites. And also there are implications if we remove too much water from our waste streams, with making transportation of slurries more difficult. So there are some reasons why having water in our circuit can also be a very helpful thing from a processing and from a management point of view. But of course, mining also interacts with water. So it's not just about needing water for operations, but also the way that mining operations interact with surrounding water systems. That is an important aspect of water management as well. I'm sure the picture on the top left is probably one that some of you have seen before. It was certainly in the news when the Bowen Basin floods happened in Queensland, some years ago now. But those expenses around the excess discharge of water for coal mines was a very significant expense at that time. We also have situations where mines are in competition with other users in water scarce areas. And increasingly, I find these two pictures on the bottom kind of topics that come up very often when I'm engaging with First Nations representatives and community members on water issues. So the long-term kind of water quality issues around mine closure are certainly top of mind for many communities. And also the risks of infrastructure failure, and in particular tailings, of course, are very significant concerns right now. And although there's many triggers for tailings dam failures, excess water can be one of those triggers. And so the way that we manage water, or the way that companies manage water within the mining operation, can have implications and potentially increase the risks of those kinds of failure events. So there's lots of important aspects to consider when we're operating mining projects and thinking about what those impacts can be for surrounding communities and the environment. And then when we look at, kind of where the industry is heading and just some of these broad, visuals here I wanted to show. I don't expect you to look at the charts in great detail, but really I just wanted to show some key trends that highlight, why water is continuing to be a hot topic and why it's continuing to be important. One challenge is that average ore grades are declining, which won't be a surprise to those of you working on mining issues. But history tells us that as we mine lower ore grades, we typically use more water and energy to process those. So although we can certainly make technological advances to enable less water to be used in our operations, if we don't change those fundamental mechanisms that we use for processing ore, we will continue to use more water and more energy to process them. And there's also some trade-offs around the water and energy side as well, which I'll talk to a little bit later. And then thirdly, because these ore grades are declining, we naturally need to dig more rock out of the ground in order to generate the product we want to get. And so that comes with larger waste rock facilities and larger tailings dams, which also have implications for long-term closure and long-term water issues as well. So these challenges around water are certainly continuing to be an important area from a technical perspective. And then, of course, the social side of water is one that is also of growing importance. And these data are, a little bit old now from some years ago, but they really speak to the fact that mining conflict is a growing issue for many companies globally. And I know there's been some great work at SMI as well from Daniel Franks and others who've looked at, the costs of conflict and what that means for companies, and certainly, significant kind of business risks associated with conflict. When you delve down into what the drivers of conflict are, there's always a lot of reasons for company and community conflict, but very often environmental issues are one of the key issues in dispute, and water issues being a key area of that. And I do see that increasing in my work, that communities are often have quite a number of concerns around water related issues. So that's another reason why from company perspective, paying attention to water is also a growing area of concern. And what I find also very interesting in this realm of water and the different actors that are kind of having an influence on the mining sector and its overall management of water is that we've had this growing influence of the investment community in recent years. And here I'm just showing some examples from the efforts that have come through the Church of England and other investor groups that really called for much more transparency in tailings disclosure, but we're seeing similar trends as well in water disclosure more generally. We certainly are seeing a growth in what investors are asking for. We have, the sector has a growing number of frameworks and reporting mechanisms that are coming out that they're expected to respond to. So this drive for more transparency and more accountability in the area of water and tailings is something that's not only coming from communities, but increasingly coming as well from investor groups. So I think it's a very exciting time to be working on this topic because, we are seeing really a new group in a lot of ways putting pressure on the sector. And I think in some really positive ways as well in terms of how investors are able to drive, better decisions in companies. So I think we're just on the cusp of what that will look like. So this is just an example of some of the data we've been analysing through with one of my PhD students, Sally. And so, when I think back and reflect back to when I was doing my PhD and even earlier than that, when I was working in the mining sector, I'd say that we were really in the very early kind of a different phase of what what water and mining was all about and what water management meant within mining. So typically the kinds of activities that were important for mining companies at that time were really quite engineering focused. So activities such as meeting operational water supply needs, avoiding discharge volumes and qualities, making sure that the quality in the processing plant was acceptable from a production point of view, and certainly efforts to reuse and recycle water have been important strategies for mining companies for some years. So that kind of, when I would think about what water and mining was all about, that's probably the kind of list I would have told you if you'd asked me 10 years ago. And this is quite consistent as well with, with what ICMM, what we've seen in guidelines such as ICMM and how they describe good water management over time. But what's been happening more recently is, on account of these, I would say, these pressures from different external actors such as communities and investors, we are seeing this push towards the industry needing to do much more than just the technical side of water. So this concept of water stewardship being much more about an externally oriented strategy, which is, some describe as being beyond the fence. It's looking outwards to what the community are thinking about the industry. And so the things on the right are what the ICMM describes as things that are important for a water stewardship strategy. And what I find, I find a number of things about this very interesting when we think about how strategies have needed to shift. But I would say those, that last dot point on the right, there being, water stewardship still requires companies to manage water very well within the boundary of their fence. So we still have to do all of those very good technical sides of water management, but we need to go further than that as well. And companies are being pushed much more into the need for more transparency in public reporting, more proactive and inclusive engagement with other stakeholders. That's always been important for companies, but I think now even more so, and especially in the area of water. And also this kind of pressure to adopt more of a catchment-based approach to decision making. And I think this raises a lot of very interesting research questions as well around what are the responsibilities of companies relative to governments, and how do those collaborations operate in a way that is most appropriate given the influence that companies can have on regulation, for example. So making sure that that companies are not overstepping the roles of government is an important question to consider, I think, in this area. And so despite these kinds of broad trends that we're seeing in what water management and stewardship are about, I think it's still quite interesting when I look at how the sector is describing a water-related risk, that there's still quite a focus on the challenges around water issues, such as scarcity, stress, flooding, infrastructure decay. It's still a relatively narrow definition of what a risk might be, and doesn't necessarily, capture what those complexities might look like beyond the fence in the stewardship realm. And so I think the industry is still starting to really work out what a water stewardship strategy is all about and how they can get there. And, definitely from some of the more recent conferences that I've been involved in, we're still getting a lot of questions from companies around how to make that transition from management to stewardship, who to engage, how to engage, how transparent should we be as companies with external actors. And so I think it's again, an interesting time to be working on these questions. And so I think broadly, there's really a need for the industry to be thinking about not only the business risks on the left-hand side, which is, I think, kind of what I would describe more as a management approach, but also to be reflecting much more on these broader societal and environment risks that can arise beyond the fence, and really understanding how that can impact the overall company. So I think the need for a better and a deeper definition definition of water risk is really, really important, so that we're acknowledging that water management is not just about the technical components, but it's about this ability to see the larger picture and to appreciate what those concerns may be among local stakeholders beyond the company, and to be able to address those really well. So that's where I feel would be a valuable direction for the sector to be moving in future. And so my research program at UBC is really kind of focused on these two different dimensions of water-related issues. So on the left-hand side, on the one hand, I do a lot of research looking at how we can better understand and develop models to mitigate against the more kind of engineering risks and the risks of scarcity, flooding, and what that means in terms of infrastructure at the site. But also my work is increasingly also doing research in the water stewardship domain as well, where I'm starting to look much more at what these impacts can look like beyond the company, what we can do from a regulatory side as well to kind of have better long-term management plans for closure issues. And ultimately, I think the need for collaboration between companies and these other external stakeholders that are beyond the company is only going to become ever more important into the future. And so my work at UBC, being between an engineering school and a policy school, is naturally perfect for allowing me to kind of explore these issues from those different dimensions. And so the overarching goal really of the research I do is about understanding what does water risk mean from the perspective of companies? What does it mean for investors, for First Nations right holders, and for governments? And what kind of strategies can we do to reduce threats, but also to maximise opportunities, because there's a lot of those that exist in the water domain as well. So I wanted to just touch upon, some of the reasons why I think it's been difficult for companies to fully transition towards this broader kind of stewardship paradigm, which is really quite a different way of operating in companies and in the sector. So when I was reflecting back on my PhD work, which I did at SMI, I was using social network analysis to look at how different individuals and a company spoke to one another about different issues. So I did a detailed case study project at one mining site. So I actually ran a survey with over 400 employees at that site, and I asked them a range of questions in the survey, including, who are the people that you talk to for information relevant to your job. And I also asked, who do you go to if you have problems? Who are your friends? And whenever I looked at those networks, there was always some connection between the two departments of the mining and processing teams, which are kind of the two key departments on sites that have a lot of control and influence over the water balance. But interestingly, when I asked them, who do you talk to about water issues, I'd observed a real disconnect in those communications. And so on the left, you can see that there's obviously not a huge amount of collaboration between mining and processing, and that's probably what we would expect, because it's much more likely that you'll be talking directly with your colleagues about information relevant to your job. But I was still very surprised when I visualized the network on the right that water was a topic which, there's two things about this network that are interesting. So each dot represents a person in the organization, and the size shows what level in the organizational hierarchy they are. And then the line shows who they nominated as people they spoke to. So you can see the network on the right is much smaller than the one on the left, which basically means that a lot of people said they don't talk to anyone about water at all, or that they talk to much fewer people than they do about information generally relevant to their job. The other thing, of course, is that we do see this disconnect in the linking between these two groups. And what was interesting was when I put the representatives from the health, safety and environment team in the network, they were really central in bridging this communication between those two predominant production departments. And so I think, it's not a surprise for me to perhaps tell you that the mining sector is often very siloed when we look at an organizational perspective. But this was a really, a way of visualizing what that looked like within a particular company. And I think from having presented this diagram now to a lot of different sites, this kind of picture is not uncommon. It can be very difficult for sites to prioritize water relative to other production needs, and to really embed water as a philosophy that's important across the organisation. And very often, water is sometimes perceived as being a compliance issue. It's a responsibility of the environment team. But in order to really solve a lot of the challenges that I outlined earlier around, what good water management and stewardship look like, it very much does need collaboration across the site. So I think there's a lot of work to do in thinking about how we connect the technical and the social domain within companies to be able to fully manage water issues in a systems level. Another challenge for the sector in terms of moving towards a more stewardship paradigm is around the challenges of external engagement. And I really love this, results from a survey that we ran some years ago. We surveyed respondents, 88 people from the AusIMM and the CIM. We had roughly the same number of respondents from each organisation. It's kind of interesting to look at the differences between AusIMM and CIM, which we can reflect on later if people are interested. Maybe the Australians have been less optimistic about how much they engage. But in any case, the question we were asking, we were interested in how often engineers were to ask the community for input on mine design decisions, within kind of exploration projects and early stage projects. How often would they engage with communities in doing their mine designs? And as you can see from the numbers here, it's pretty common, or it's relatively uncommon for companies to engage communities in that early mine design stage. And I think that we do often see this challenge with when do we engage, how do we engage with communities, and what does it mean to connect those engineering decisions we have on the technical side with local communities, and what's the best mechanism for that? So there was definitely a recognition from other questions in the survey that people felt stakeholder engagement and community engagement was really important. But when it came to what was happening in practice, we definitely saw a gap there and an area for a lot of improvement. And I think although this focused on kind of the early stage of mine design, I think we would probably observe, a similar thing when we thought about, other elements of what engagement should look like. So that ability to connect the technical decisions with community concerns is an area that we continue to research within my team at UBC. Another challenge which does influence this aspect of stewardship is around how we value water. Water is something that has, it has a monetary value. It has a monetary value that's very high when we don't have it. So when we suddenly run out of water, it's obviously very important that we can get water, so we're willing to pay a lot for it. But how we value the impacts of water on ecosystems, on communities is a much more challenging question. And one of my master's students in her research, she wasn't necessarily focusing on water, but she was looking at how project teams and sustainability teams conceptualize non-technical risks and what they mean by that. And really a lot of her work highlighted that there was a real disconnect between the perspectives of sustainability professionals and project professionals around valuing things that were a bit more perceived as a bit more soft. So the non-technical issues, so PP stands for project professional, SP is sustainability professional. So as engineers, we generally, prefer things we can quantify. And sometimes when we can't quantify things, it's easier not to integrate them into our decision-making, which I think is unfortunate. So we definitely need, a change in mindset, in skill set and in toolkit around how we consider the more, sustainability or social elements of issues such as water. And if we're not able to put an economic value on it, is there a different way we can incorporate those considerations into our decision making? So we're also thinking a lot in my team about and working on some approaches for integrating these non-technical things and considerations into the way we make decisions. Another area of research that we've been working on is also this idea of what I'm calling trade-offs here, but really just recognizing that often when we make decisions about how to manage water, it's not always that obvious what should we be optimizing to. So I think if you look back even 5 years ago on the kinds of targets that companies were setting for sustainability performance around water, a lot of targets are really around efficiency. So, blanket statements that we're going to reduce water use by X% and that that's an aspirational goal. And in some cases, those kinds of goals may make a lot of sense. But I think we also have to be cautious in recognizing how difficult water-related decisions are in terms of what the impacts are on other areas. So if we have an efficiency goal and we're in an area that is very water scarce and we're pumping water from a long way away, we may actually save water we may save energy by saving water. So if we're in a place like Chile where we're pumping water very long distances, water saving may also result in an energy saving. But in other situations, when we save water, we may actually have an energy cost because a lot of technologies for reducing water use and recycling, such as advanced filtration on tailings dams, on tailings streams, they use a lot of energy. So if we save water, we might have an energy cost. And which of those objectives is more important? I think there's still a lot, even though that's a topic that's been studied now for some time. I think how we make those decisions, it remains an area where there's a need for more research. Another area is in the area of water quality and quantity trade-offs. So, a lot of projects may, especially in places like Canada here, aspirations towards having zero discharge operations, where that may be a really important goal to have to try and avoid discharge of contaminated water to local water bodies. But the challenge with being zero discharge in a very strict sense is that if you end up accumulating and storing lots of water on site, and then you suddenly have a flood because you're not able to discharge that water quickly, it can have many more consequential environmental impacts, potentially contribute to infrastructure failures, which was some tailings, Mount Poly tailings dam failure, which happened here in Canada back in 2015. Having too much water stored on site was one of the issues that contributed to that collapse, and also the buildup of contaminants within water systems as well. So if we're recirculating, we're continually recirculating water when we do need to discharge, it may end up having more quality implications as well. So again, it's not always that obvious that zero discharge is always zero discharge or very high reuse rates are necessarily always the best option. And likewise, there's a number of questions around, closure trade-offs. So as we implement technologies to reduce water use, such as filtration and dry stack, we are changing the kind of moisture content in our final waste stream. And, does that result in some cases to different long-term closure liabilities, and what does that look like? And I think there's still some interesting work to be done on that. So just to say that I think, in the work we're doing within my team at UBC, we're really interested in understanding how do we make decisions about what is a good water management and a stewardship strategy, and what kind of approaches can we use to engage widely with stakeholders both within and beyond the company in order to make those decisions in a way that will be most desirable, because there's never going to be a perfect solution to many of these things, which is what makes it so exciting and interesting. So I'm just checking the time there. So I want to just kind of close by explaining a little bit some of the research that we've been developing at UBC through the Bradshaw Research Initiative. So this is kind of a broader initiative through BRIM, which I've been leading the water stewardship planning. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with BRIM, it's a kind of a cross-campus initiative that was established a few years ago now. John Steen, who was previously at UQ in the business school, is now with us at UBC. Some of you may have met John before. He's the director of BRIM. And so BRIM's ultimate goal is to drive transformation of the mining sector by connecting researchers and industry to generate solutions, for the broad economy, society, and the environment. And so ultimately what BRIM is aiming to do is to really connect different researchers across the campus at UBC and to develop collaborative industry projects. I think the broader objectives of BRIM also very much include engagement with government and local communities. And as you'll see from some of the work we've been doing in the water space, this is absolutely a key priority of what we've been doing as well. So there's 4 areas of research within BRIM. Today I'm going to focus on the water stewardship theme, which is the one on which I've been most closely involved. And so UBC is a really great university for water-related research. As a whole, we have significant expertise across the campus on water issues. Before BRIM's stewardship theme kicked off, I was also involved in a future waters cluster, which was non-mining related. It was very much bringing together different faculties across the campus of UBC to work on water-related research questions. And so some of the work we've been doing within the BRIM strategic planning is building upon some of those initial networks that were established through Future Waters. So Future Waters is an interdisciplinary group, as I said, that's much more broader water issues. We have people who have an engineering background, but also policy and governance. And within BRIM, we've been building upon those cluster activities and refining a mining focus. And it's been really exciting to be part of this planning initiative. So far, we've attracted 15 faculty members who are actively engaged, and we've been able to collaborate across 8 departments. So it's been a really great initiative to be leading. What we did was we actually started our strategic planning activities last November, December. We held a collaborative workshop together with BRIM and the Future Waters Cluster, where we had 41 participants, and you can see from the orange there at the bottom how diverse we had a representation. So we're bringing together academics as well as industry representatives, First Nations representatives, governments and NGOs. We then followed that up with one-on-one consultations where we spoke to many of the individuals who'd come to that initial workshop to further understand what their needs were in the area of water and what they saw as some of the priorities we might further advance from a research perspective. And then over the past month, back in April, we actually ran 3 what I call theme workshops. So we had 20, roughly 20 people, sometimes more than that, in each workshop, where we focused on key topics that had come out of those earlier activities we'd been doing. And this has really helped us to refine what those research directions are that we plan to advance in future research. We've also had faculty meetings as well, where we've engage just with the faculty core to think about what our expertise is and make sure that what we define as our strategic priorities are in fact areas that we have the right expertise in to solve. And so in mid-June, and I think we've just confirmed the date for the 16th of June, we'll be having a launch webinar where we'll be explaining in more detail what the areas of research will be for our collaborative work going forward. And we'll also be producing a strategy document to further advance that work. So just to tell you a little bit about what we heard, particularly from some of those early workshops, these are kind of 4 things that were most front of mind for me from looking back on those activities. One of them was around the importance of data sharing and transparency, and I did speak earlier on about some of these pressures that the industry is starting to see in water-related areas in terms of community expectations on data sharing, but also from investor groups. And so that trend is something that certainly we're seeing continue, also from government as well, around this expectation of being more transparent. But there were also some questions raised, particularly from our First Nations representatives, around who owns that data. So when we're starting to deal with big data and we're looking at using satellite data to answer questions around water systems, who owns that data and how transparent is that how transparently is that shared? I think these are questions that are going to become increasingly important as we move into a lot more large data analytics in the area of water. There was also a lot of discussion around financialization of risk, and especially around closure liabilities. So a recognition that these impacts that are felt by surrounding communities and the environment, aren't captured right now in the kind of ways that we measure impact, and the kinds of financial frameworks we have for making decisions around technological choices. They're quite narrowly defined in a way that may not always allow us to make the best decisions for minimizing that impact on other groups. And so I think, again, another area that we'll be focusing on in future. It was really rewarding to be able to bring a lot of these different groups together, and I hope we can continue to do that, because I do think that there's certainly a lot of recognition here in the BC context that engaging Indigenous rights holders right from the beginning is a really important objective that we should all be aiming for. And so I think it's been great that we've been able to have some Indigenous representatives in our workshops so far, and it's something we continue to want to prioritise in our work going forward. And this relationship between water and tailings was also very important. And in the first workshop we ran, we got people to nominate which session they were most interested to go to, and the topic of tailings was really top of mind for many of our participants. So I think, as I said earlier, this recognition that the way we manage water issues does have a lot of implications for tailings risks, for closure liabilities, for potential failure events, and so again, something that we will continue to focus on. So going forward, we've kind of identified three main areas that we plan to advance in BRIM's water stewardship theme in future. And so these will be areas that we see as the strengths that we have within our team, and that we are rapidly starting to develop more projects in collaboration with our industry, our government, and our First Nations partners. And I wanted to also kind of just put this slide up because I thought it was really interesting hearing some reflections from some of the participants on what makes collaboration difficult. I've talked about stewardship as needing to be something that is much more integrative with representatives from beyond the company and also interdisciplinary. And you can just see from looking at these charts, a general feeling that, we're either we're not really sure how effective we are, or maybe we're not very effective, but only 25% of respondents feeling that we were currently good at building interdisciplinary and multi-partner teams. And when we looked at, what the barriers were to having more of those collaborative conversations, the level of time and effort required is definitely a challenge. And I think that's where institutes like BRIM can really make a big difference by giving us those platforms to allow that to happen. But certainly there's lots of challenges we face in doing these collaborative partnerships, but I think they're absolutely crucial for research in future. So in summary, just to say that, mining is associated with a lot of different risks. And I think, as somebody researching water-related issues and risks, I'm very consciously trying to recognise that the way a company may define a water risk might be very different to how others perceive the risks that they experience and feel. And so from a company perspective, that there's also, could benefit in many cases by recognising more what those risks may look like from the perspective of surrounding stakeholders, and be able to incorporate some of those, otherwise what we might call non-technical risks into the way decisions are made from an engineering point of view. We do need systems approaches that look at these issues across different scales and from different points of view. And then within BRIM, we are making a conscious effort to really engage widely with different actors. And before I close out, I just wanted to mention for those of you who are in Brisbane, because there is the Sustainability Research and Innovation Conference coming up next month in the middle of June. And I've been leading a session in collaboration with the people shown on the screen there. It's actually a really, really exciting group to be working with. You'll see we've got a lot of collaborators in Brisbane, including Neil from SMI. And as well as colleagues from chemical engineering, the International Water Centre, and from AWMC. So this idea of looking at the entanglements of efficiency was something that Stephen Conrad, Steve Pratt, and I started talking about when Stephen Pratt was on sabbatical at UBC a couple of years ago. And so through those conversations, we realised that the questions I've raised about water efficiency and whether or not that's a good objective for mining were actually similar questions were cropping up when we think about urban systems and agricultural systems as well. So this session is really aimed at explaining some of the challenges around a kind of a narrow focus on efficiency as a desirable operating philosophy for water, and with a focus particularly on the Sustainable Development Goals. What does it mean if we focus on efficiency objectives for water? What are some of those trade-offs that may happen around other Sustainable Development Goals? So that's what we'll be doing in our interactive session on Monday, the 14th of June. So if any of you are attending the SRI conference, it would be really, really great to see you there. We will be doing it online, given that not all of us are in Brisbane. Yeah, I really hope that some of you might be able to join us. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to close it out there. I think I should be just about on time. But if anybody had any questions or wanted to connect with me, you can always reach out to me by email. I've got my Twitter handle there, also on LinkedIn, or you can reach me on Google Scholar. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because otherwise I can't see your questions. So I'll just close that now and open up the floor if anyone has any feedback or things you'd like me to clarify.
Thanks very much. So thank you, Nadja. It was really insightful talking to the work that you were doing, and clearly an aspect that's really relevant across all streams in the mining sector. So a lot of interest here in the room. I will open up first to anybody in the room who has any questions. It would be great, and I can jump online and see if we have any questions as well from the audience. So does anybody have any questions or comments in the room? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Nadja. It's not really my area, but I really enjoyed that. I'm just curious whether you've got any good examples at this point already for good transparency and development of mutual trust between the companies and the local communities, I guess, specifically on the water issue, where they have been able to work together and make a plan that works for everybody.
I mean, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I probably can give you more examples of where things have not always worked so well. But I suppose one of the things I would talk, there's probably two examples I'll talk to, and I have published on some of these examples before. So one of them was when I was working with IFC before I joined UBC. I was involved in a collaboration. I was a technical specialist for the International Finance Corporation, which was an investor in the Oyu Tolgoi mine in Mongolia. And so we were working with 13 different companies in the South Gobi around improving the way they were doing their water accounting and improving the way that those companies were engaging externally with local communities. And so I think whether, we haven't been able, as far as I'm aware, I don't think we've actually measured trust over time, as you know, to kind of validate how that's really how effective it's been. I'm sure that there's still some ongoing monitoring to do exactly that. But I think generally an example of where, and probably the first experience for me actually, of where I was trying to communicate technical information about the water system to local communities in a way that would facilitate better understanding and better decision making. So that's kind of one thing I would speak to. And I think in that context, it was really important having IFC there as a central actor to convene the different groups together. And we also had a lot of government representatives involved in some of the roundtables we were running. I think it is a scenario where there are quite a lot of conflicts among local herders and mining companies in the region. And so having an actor that is more distant from the company provided kind of a bit more trust and credibility in the data that we're producing. So that's kind of one example I would speak to. The other one is my colleague Jocelyn Fraser did her PhD research looking at the Cerro Verde mine in Peru, and they had been doing a lot of really great work as their project was transitioning and expanding from into a larger operation. They actually engaged quite widely with local stakeholders around where they could source water from for the expansion. And most of the, traditionally those mines in that area, a water scarce area of Peru, had been using, I believe it was groundwater sources in the past, and there was a lot of conflict around using that source. So they were actually able to work in collaboration with the local government to set up a wastewater treatment facility to treat the sewage water from the local population, which wasn't being treated before. And so they were able to clean up that water and also provide a water source for the mine expansion. So that was another example of where I think there's been good collaborative partnerships between companies and a community. But as I said, unfortunately, I also have lots of bad examples, but I won't speak to those. They're just there's some examples that come to mind for me of things that are worth mentioning.
Good answer. Nadja, I don't know whether you've got the question box open up in your screen. There was a question from Gordon Valentine just talking about transparency and reporting of water consumption. He mentioned that man overlapped with Karen's question. I don't know whether you can comment whether he did or not. And then there's a kind of a similar question from Vanessa, but where at the bottom, which also talks about mine mobility and competition issues with regards to data sharing. So I don't know if you have managed on that.
Yeah, thank you. I can see those there. I can see the one from Grant about the transparency and reporting. I mean, I think for me, the reporting of water consumption, there's been a lot of really great work by Stephen Northey and a lot of others on reporting data in, historical reporting data by the mining sector. And a lot of the conclusions that have been reached by those analyses have said that we've come a long way, but not quite far enough, I guess, in a nutshell. I do think the ICMM put out reporting standards back in 2017 that built upon the water accounting framework that SMI developed with the Minerals Council some years ago. And I think that was really, really important to getting consistency in the way that sites were measuring their water use. So I think we're getting better at being more consistent in how sites are accounting for water. Unfortunately, when you pick up most sustainability reports these days, I find it difficult to interpret that data because it's very rarely reported at a site level. It's usually aggregated across a whole company. And so that may or may not be helpful or interesting, especially if your question is more a local question. So it's a long way of saying to Grant's question, I think we're on a good direction, but I still see a lot of issues in terms of reporting generally. And I think it can also be challenging to kind of source that data because there's not one central place to go to for water consumption data, for example. Another key thing that Stephen Northey found when he was looking at historical water reporting was also that there's quite a large emphasis on the water inputs to site, but not as much reporting about the outputs. And so whether that's because sites are zero discharge and they're not discharging very much, that could be one reason. But I think, we need to recognise that water issues are not just about scarcity, which sometimes it can feel, and that actually there's much more complex questions that often communities have as well. And so to Vanessa's question about data sharing, I think that's also a very, very fair point. I think there are some hesitations around data sharing from companies. What is the reason for sharing data? What kind of data should be shared? And I think it can be difficult to find the balance that will satisfy communities who may be demanding or investors asking for lots of data. Even from a government side, is there capacity to be able to interpret and make sense of that data? I think we do need also to recognise that there can be lots of lots of different challenges around that interpretation piece as well. But yeah, I have heard from companies, that have certainly had some hesitations of sharing too openly for some of the reasons you mentioned. I don't think I've got a good solution to that yet, but it's certainly a question that is a challenging one. Nathan, I don't know if you want to guide me on which one I should ask next.
For the people online, I'll read out I might go with the Scott Dunbar question here, which is for the fellows online, you mentioned the monetisation of the risk that mining poses directly to water, I suppose, in the communities and elsewhere in the mining sector. But can you talk about how that can be reversed, i.e. to monetise the risk of water to mining in the event of climate change? I suppose, mines that have 20 or 30 year mine lives, obviously these things aren't static, so it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think that, that question of what risk does water pose to an operation, I think is one. I think there's been probably a reasonable amount of work done on that. I think we've still got further to go. So even going back to some of the work I was doing in my PhD, and my colleague Wenying Liu, who also did her PhD at SMI, was looking at water quality risks and monetising those risks on production. I think there has been some good work done around that. Often when we quantify those risks, they're not often quantified in financial terms. So in my PhD work, for example, I was quantifying risks of scarcity and flooding events from the perspective of how often that would happen, but I never got to the point where I was putting it into financial terms. So it's something I'm actively thinking about, and certainly things like climate change really intensify what that looks like. So it's really another form of uncertainty that we have that we need to also incorporate into the way we monetize those risks. So climate change is certainly here in the Canadian context is also a really, really important issue, especially for areas in the north where we've got melting permafrost, and there's a lot of elements that come with climate change risks that I don't think we've begun to fully understand how expensive they will be, but certainly an area where we need to do more work around that.
Okay, thank you. That's quite answer. There's another question relating in your water stewardship section. You consider risks to people. How are you considering risks to the environment, fauna and flora as well? That was from Delphine. Yeah,
it's a great point, and I think I guess I was, so that framework or that picture. I mentioned in the diagram that it was inspired by some work that Diana Kemp had written on social risk, and talking about the fact that the social risks are not often, or kind of a conflated term. So that was definitely an inspiration for that diagram. But I do think this point of about when I was thinking about the risks, I was thinking about the people that experience those risks. So whether the kind of the human element, so whether it be companies, communities, investors. So for me, a lot of the time, community concerns are closely linked to environment. But I think it's a very fair point to acknowledge that for me, environment was kind of inherent in some of those other concerns that that come up around what those impacts on broader water systems are, and then they often manifest through the concerns that are raised by communities or investors. So that would be my answer to your question there, Delphine.
Thank you very much. So there's a question from Neil McIntyre in the chat box,
Okay.
which is just asking about, I think you mentioned about how renewable energy, well, you mentioned how changing to waterless or low water technologies are energy very high energy consumptive. Can renewable energy transform water management in mind? I don't know whether there's from a technological perspective, but there's probably a deeper subtext to his question that you might be able to tap into. But
Yeah.
the question is, are we technologically advancing our management of water in the mining sector?
So to answer Neil's question, I mean, I think one of the big opportunities we have is around like energy storage with, for example, hydropower facilities. That's like one really obvious thing for me with the renewables. So especially in places like Canada where hydro can be, a key part of the system. But yeah, I think there certainly are opportunities for us to kind of create synergies between when we're pumping and what that means for water, and in areas where transportation of water is a large capex or a large energy use, using renewables for that. And water is something that we can use as a storage in a lot of respects if we're using pumping as a mechanism for storage. So I think it's a great point, Neil, and something I'd love to talk with you more about. I did also see a question about water-related risks and assessment. One of my PhD students, Alice Guimaras, is focusing very much on water risk assessments in mining. There's a lot of different tools that are out there for looking at water-related risks, and part of her PhD involves analysing those different frameworks and looking at which ones are most applicable to mining, because the broad realm of water risk assessment is very, very broad. There's not very many tools that are specifically designed for mining applications, and so that's an area that she's actively been focusing on for her PhD work.
That's great, thank you. I think you've worked your way through the entire question list. Do we have any other questions in the room? One more question.
I think you pointed out earlier in your talk that most of the water that's used on a mine site comes from processing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's grinding, classification, flotation and leaching, and the tailings disposal that goes with that. So a simple solution to this whole problem is to not use water at all and to use dry processing techniques, of which there are plenty around and have been for decades. They've all got their problems. I just wondered whether any of the research that you've seen or is associated with has ever considered spending more time thinking about moving to less water-intensive processing?
It's a really good question, and if I can, my eyes are getting worse, I think. But if I see who that is, I think it might be Tim Napier-Munn asking that question. It's funny because. Hi, Tim. I actually, I was doing some writing on this idea of waterless processing a couple of years ago, and I was going back to your papers from quite some time ago. I think the challenges of going waterless are very similar to what you'd written about some years ago. And honestly, I haven't seen very much written about it since some of the work you did. Again, it was probably 10 years ago that I saw that conference paper from you. But I think the challenges around dust management, around increased energy use are certainly there. There are absolutely different ways we can process where we're kind of so some of the work my team has been doing has been looking at. We've actually got two partnerships at the moment, one with FLS and one with ERIES, where we're focusing on kind of the financial benefits of water saving and what technologies there are for saving water. So I think we'll get into this a bit more deeply. But in short, it is difficult to go. There's lots of aspirations to go waterless mining. I'm not yet convinced that we've got the that it necessarily is going to be the best strategy everywhere because of all the kind of the trade-offs that come with that approach. But are there directions that are moving in you know, us to be able to do that? I think definitely yes. But I would say the innovations are still not there yet in terms of managing the kinds of issues that get associated as we start to remove water from the process. So that's my feeling at this point, but whether that will change as I start to learn a bit more about mineral processing, I will keep you informed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. That was a great question and great answer as well. I think that's probably time for today. Nadja, thanks so much for joining us. Your afternoon from Vancouver. It's been great to have you online, and good to see you over here next time you get to travel back to Australia.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone again. If you can just join me, thank you, Nadja, one more time.
Thanks everyone.